Step out of the vehicle now. Officer Bradley Thompson's command cut through the humid Alabama evening air, with the sharp edge of authority mixed with barely concealed aggression, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture that was meant to intimidate as much as to demonstrate readiness. The flashing blue and red lights from his patrol car painted the rural roadside in alternating colors that made everything feel surreal and threatening, transforming an ordinary traffic stop into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. Colonel James Mitchell, 62 years old with silver gray hair cut military short and a bearing that spoke of decades of leadership and discipline, sat calmly in the driver's seat of his 15-year-old Honda Accord, both hands visible on the steering wheel exactly as he'd been trained to position them in situations like this. His expression neutral despite the anger and fear warring inside his chest. He had been driving home from the Veterans Affairs office in Montgomery, where he'd spent the afternoon helping younger veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze of disability claims and benefits applications. Volunteer work he did twice a week because he understood better than most how the system could overwhelm people who were already struggling with physical injuries and psychological trauma. "Sir, may I ask why you pulled me over?" James asked in a calm, measured voice, the tone he'd perfected over 38 years of military service when dealing with volatile situations that required de-escalation rather than confrontation. "I was traveling at 53 miles per hour in a 55 zone. My vehicle registration is current, all my lights are functioning properly, and I signaled every turn and lane change." Officer Thompson stepped closer to the window, his flashlight beam cutting across James's face in a way that felt deliberately aggressive rather than professionally cautious. "I said step out of the vehicle. I'm not going to ask again. Keep your hands where I can see them and move slowly. Don't make any sudden movements or reach for anything without announcing it first." There was something in Thompson's voice beyond standard police caution, something that James had heard too many times throughout his life despite his service and accomplishments. The assumption that his skin color made him dangerous, suspicious, worthy of fear and aggressive treatment regardless of his actual behavior or threat level. James complied slowly, opening his door with exaggerated care and stepping out onto the gravel shoulder with his hands raised and visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening in every possible way. He was wearing his Army dress uniform because he'd been asked to speak briefly at a high school career day event on his way home from the VA office, talking to students about service and leadership and the opportunities military careers could provide for young people from all backgrounds. The uniform was immaculate as always, every ribbon and badge precisely positioned according to regulations he could recite from memory, the fabric pressed with creases sharp enough to cut paper, the shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the patrol car's flashing lights. What Officer Thompson hadn't noticed yet, what his preconceived assumptions and apparent eagerness to demonstrate authority had prevented him from seeing, was the light blue ribbon with white stars that hung at James's neck. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded for valor in combat, worn by fewer than 70 living recipients in the entire country. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Thompson commanded, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he was enjoying this exercise of power more than professional duty required. James complied without protest, assuming the position against his car while Thompson approached from behind, his movements aggressive and his breathing audible in the quiet evening air. "I'm going to search you for weapons. If you're carrying anything that might hurt me, you need to tell me right now." James kept his voice calm and respectful despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Officer, I'm not carrying any weapons. I'm a retired Army officer returning home from volunteer work at the Veterans Affairs office. My identification and vehicle registration are in my wallet in my right front pocket, and I have no contraband or illegal items in my possession or my vehicle." But Thompson was already patting him down roughly, his hands more aggressive than necessary for a routine safety check, clearly enjoying the power dynamic he'd established regardless of whether any actual threat existed. A second patrol car pulled up behind Thompson's vehicle, and Officer Sarah Chun stepped out, her expression immediately shifting from routine backup response to visible concern as she took in the scene illuminated by multiple sets of flashing lights. She'd been on the force for 8 years, long enough to recognize when a traffic stop had gone sideways, when officer safety had crossed the line into something else entirely. "Thompson, what we got here?" she called out, approaching cautiously while her eyes scanned the situation for signs of actual danger versus manufactured drama. "Routine traffic stop. Driver was acting suspicious. Needed to secure the scene before proceeding," Thompson replied without taking his attention off James, though his explanation didn't match what Chen was observing. An older man in military dress uniform, complying perfectly with every instruction, showing no signs of aggression or resistance, clearly not presenting any legitimate threat. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Chen asked, addressing James directly rather than going through Thompson, her tone professional but significantly less aggressive than her colleague's approach. "Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army, retired," James replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to respect and responsibility despite his current position against a car being treated like a criminal. "I was pulled over for reasons that haven't been explained to me, and I'm complying fully with Officer Thompson's instructions despite not understanding what justification exists for this level of response to what should be a routine traffic interaction." Chen's eyebrows rose at the rank and the measured eloquence of his response, and she stepped closer to examine his uniform more carefully, her flashlight beam moving across the ribbons and insignia that told the story of a distinguished military career to anyone who understood how to read the language of military decorations. "Thompson," Chen said quietly but with unmistakable urgency, "I need you to step back for a moment and look at this uniform more carefully." But Thompson was committed now to whatever script he'd started following, unwilling or unable to acknowledge that he might have made a serious miscalculation. "I don't care if he's wearing a clown suit or a ball gown. He was driving in a vehicle that matched the description of a suspect vehicle from an incident last week, and I have every right to conduct a thorough investigation before I let him go on his way." The excuse was flimsy, and they all knew it. The description of older model sedan driven by a black male was so generic it could apply to thousands of vehicles and drivers, and using it as justification for this level of aggressive response revealed more about Thompson's biases than about any legitimate law enforcement concerns. James remained silent and motionless against his car, his military training serving him well in a situation where any sudden movement or emotional response could escalate into genuine danger. At 62 years old, having commanded soldiers in combat zones, having made decisions that affected thousands of lives, having received the nation's highest honor for extraordinary heroism under fire, he found himself reduced to this moment. Hands on a car, being treated as a threat by someone young enough to be his son, in a country he'd served for nearly 4 decades and shed blood to defend. The irony wasn't lost on him, but the immediate priority was survival. Getting through this encounter without injury or arrest, maintaining dignity in circumstances specifically designed to strip it away. Chen moved closer to James's position, her flashlight now focusing on the distinctive ribbon at his neck, and her breath caught audibly as recognition fully dawned. "Thompson, stop what you're doing right now and look at his neck," she said with unmistakable command in her voice, no longer making a request, but issuing an order that her tone indicated would not be ignored or dismissed. Officer Thompson finally looked where Chen was pointing, his flashlight beam following hers to illuminate the light blue ribbon with 13 white stars that hung against James's uniform jacket. The Medal of Honor in its unmistakable configuration that anyone with military knowledge would immediately recognize. The change in Thompson's expression was almost comical in its dramatic shift from aggressive confidence to dawning horror, his face going pale even in the dim roadside lighting as he began to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated this situation. "Oh my God," he whispered, stepping backward as if physically recoiling from his own mistake. "Sir, I wasn't." The words died in his throat as he struggled to formulate something that could possibly mitigate what he'd just done, knowing that no explanation or apology could undo the humiliation he'd inflicted on someone who deserved the exact opposite of the treatment he'd received. The silence that fell over the roadside scene was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the patrol car's light bars, cycling through their warning patterns, and the distant sound of traffic on the highway half a mile away. Chun holstered her weapon and removed her hat in a gesture of respect, her expression a mixture of profound embarrassment for her colleague and genuine reverence for the man who'd been subjected to this treatment. "Colonel Mitchell, sir, on behalf of the department, I apologize deeply for this situation. Would you be willing to stand down from the vehicle so we can speak properly?" James straightened slowly, turning to face the two officers with a dignity that somehow remained intact despite everything that had just happened. The Medal of Honor caught the flashing lights and seemed to glow with its own authority, a physical reminder of valor and sacrifice that should have prevented this encounter from happening in the first place, but instead would now serve as undeniable proof of just how wrong things had gone. What Officer Bradley Thompson didn't know, what his assumptions and biases had prevented him from discovering before initiating this catastrophic traffic stop, was that Colonel James Mitchell had earned that Medal of Honor during the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, leading a rescue operation that saved 14 fellow soldiers while sustaining multiple gunshot wounds himself, refusing evacuation until every member of his unit was accounted for and secured. He had served in Desert Storm, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq across multiple deployments. He had commanded a battalion, mentored hundreds of young officers, and spent the final years of his military career working on veteran suicide prevention programs because he'd lost too many good soldiers to an enemy that struck after they'd come home. His name appeared on buildings at military installations. His tactical innovations were taught at West Point and the Command and General Staff College, and his retirement ceremony had been attended by the Secretary of Defense and 3 4-star generals. But none of that mattered to Thompson until he saw the ribbon, until the proof of exceptional service became impossible to ignore, until the disconnect between his assumptions and reality became too obvious to maintain. Officer Bradley Thompson stood frozen on the roadside, his earlier aggressive confidence completely evaporated and replaced by visible panic as the full weight of his mistakes settled over him like a physical burden he couldn't escape. His hand trembled slightly as he finally removed it from his service weapon, and sweat had begun forming on his forehead despite the cooling evening temperature. "Colonel Mitchell, sir, I sincerely apologize. I had no idea. I didn't realize I was just following protocol for a vehicle that matched a description from dispatch about a possible suspect in an unrelated incident." The explanation sounded hollow even as he spoke it, the words inadequate to address what had actually happened here, and everyone standing on that roadside knew it. Officer Sarah Chun stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between Thompson and James in a protective gesture that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Sir, again, I apologize on behalf of our department for this encounter. If you'd be willing to provide your identification so we can clear this matter officially and get you back on your way home, we would greatly appreciate your cooperation and understanding." James reached slowly for his wallet, announcing each movement before making it, because decades of experience and too many stories from other black men in similar situations had taught him that assumptions could be deadly even when you'd done nothing wrong. "I'm reaching into my right front pocket to retrieve my wallet, which contains my driver's license and vehicle registration." He produced the documents and handed them to Chun, who examined them with professional care, while Thompson stood off to the side, looking like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. "Everything appears to be in perfect order, Colonel Mitchell," Chun said after verifying the information against her patrol car's computer system. "Your license is current, your registration is valid, and obviously there are no outstanding warrants or issues with your driving record. Again, I apologize for the inconvenience and the manner in which this stop was conducted." She shot a pointed look at Thompson that promised a difficult conversation would be happening very soon about judgment, bias, and the proper conduct of traffic stops that didn't humiliate decorated war heroes. "Officer Chun, may I speak freely?" James asked, his voice still measured but carrying undertones of controlled anger that both officers could hear clearly. "I've been driving for 46 years without a single accident or serious traffic violation. I've served this country for 38 years, including 5 combat deployments where I led soldiers into situations where we knew some of us wouldn't be coming home. I've been wounded in service to this nation, decorated multiple times for valor and leadership, and I spend my retirement volunteering to help younger veterans navigate systems that can be overwhelming when you're dealing with physical injuries and psychological trauma from combat experience. And yet, I still get pulled over for matching a description that I suspect was nothing more specific than being a black man driving an older vehicle through a predominantly white area. Does that seem right to you, Officer Chin? Does that seem like the country I spent 4 decades defending? The question hung in the humid Alabama air like an indictment, challenging both officers to acknowledge what they knew to be true, even if only one of them had the courage and integrity to admit it openly. Chin's expression reflected genuine discomfort and what appeared to be honest shame, while Thompson looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else in the world at that moment. "Sir, you're absolutely right that this should never have happened," Chin said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd thought about these issues before and found her profession's practices wanting in too many instances. "I can't speak for Officer Thompson's specific reasoning for initiating this stop, but I can acknowledge that implicit bias remains a serious problem in law enforcement, that people of color continue to experience differential treatment in traffic stops and other police encounters, and that no amount of service or accomplishment seems to fully protect black Americans from being viewed with suspicion in situations where white citizens would be given the benefit of the doubt. That's not acceptable, it's not justice, and it's not the kind of policing that builds trust with the communities we're supposed to serve." James studied her face carefully, evaluating whether her words reflected genuine understanding or just well-practiced rhetoric designed to de-escalate a situation that could become politically and professionally problematic for the department. "Officer Chun, I appreciate your acknowledgement, though words are easy and systemic change is what actually matters. What concerns me most isn't even what happened to me tonight. I'm old enough and experienced enough to handle humiliation and survive these encounters, though that shouldn't be necessary. What concerns me is all the young black men and women, veterans and civilians alike, who face these same situations without the protection that this medal provides, without the rank and accomplishments that finally made Officer Thompson recognize his mistake. What happens to them? How many escalate into violence because someone like Officer Thompson lets his assumptions override his training and his basic human decency? How many families are destroyed? How many lives are ended because implicit bias turns routine traffic stops into deadly force encounters? Bradley Thompson finally found his voice again, though it came out shaky and defensive in ways that revealed he still hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of what he'd done. "Colonel Mitchell, I want you to understand that I was simply following my training and department protocols for conducting traffic stops in potentially dangerous situations. I had received information about a suspect vehicle, and your car broadly matched that description, which gave me reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop and conduct a safety check. The fact that you're a decorated veteran doesn't change the procedures I'm required to follow to ensure officer safety during these encounters. I apologize if my manner seemed aggressive, but I was simply taking appropriate precautions based on the information available to me at the time." The explanation would have been more convincing if Thompson could have maintained eye contact while delivering it, if his voice hadn't wavered on the words reasonable suspicion, if everyone present didn't understand that broadly matched meant nothing more specific than a race of the driver and the age of the vehicle. "Officer Thompson," James said, and the command presence in his voice was unmistakable now, the tone of someone who'd led soldiers in combat and expected to be heard and respected when he spoke. "I'm going to tell you something that I hope you'll remember the next time you make assumptions about someone based on their appearance rather than their actual behavior. In 1993, I was a young captain leading a platoon in Mogadishu, Somalia, during what became known as the Black Hawk Down incident. We were ambushed by hostile forces in an urban environment where every street corner could hide someone who wanted to kill us, where split-second decisions meant the difference between soldiers going home to their families or dying thousands of miles from home in a mission that most Americans would forget about within a few years. I made dozens of life-or-death judgments that day based on actual threats, actual evidence of hostile intent, actual behaviors that indicated danger, rather than simply assuming everyone who looked a certain way or lived in a certain neighborhood was an enemy who deserved to be treated with aggression and suspicion. James took a step closer to Thompson, and the younger officer actually flinched slightly, a reaction that James noted with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "I was shot 4 times that day, Officer Thompson. Twice in the leg, once in the shoulder, once through my side where the bullet missed my kidney by less than an inch according to the surgeon who eventually patched me up. And despite those wounds, despite losing blood and being in more pain than you can possibly imagine, I continued leading my soldiers, directing fire, coordinating our defense, and planning the rescue operation that eventually extracted all 14 members of my unit who were pinned down in a building surrounded by hostiles who were literally trying to burn us out. I refused evacuation 3 separate times because my soldiers needed leadership more than I needed medical attention, and I wasn't leaving anyone behind, even if it meant bleeding out in a Mogadishu street." He paused, letting that information settle, watching Thompson's face as the reality of who he'd been treating like a criminal began to fully penetrate his consciousness. "Do you know why I received the Medal of Honor, Officer Thompson?" James continued, his voice quieter now, but somehow more powerful in its controlled intensity. "Not because I was braver than anyone else in that building. Every soldier there demonstrated extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. I received it because when our extraction helicopter was hit by an RPG and crashed 2 blocks away from our position, I led a rescue team through active hostile fire to reach the crash site, knowing that every step we took increased the probability that we wouldn't make it back, knowing that the smart tactical decision would be to hold our defensive position and wait for reinforcements rather than exposing ourselves to certain ambush. But there were pilots and crew members in that crashed helicopter who were my responsibility, my brothers in arms, and I wasn't going to leave them to die because the safe choice was to stay put." He touched the Medal of Honor at his neck, his fingers gentle on the ribbon that represented so much sacrifice and pain. 3 more soldiers died during that rescue operation, Officer Thompson. Good men with families and futures and every reason to live, who died because I asked them to follow me into a situation we all knew was probably suicide, but that had to be attempted anyway, because that's what honor requires, what duty demands, what love for your fellow soldiers makes necessary, even when it costs everything. The silence that followed James's words was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the continuing rhythm of the patrol car's lights and the sound of Thompson's labored breathing as he struggled with emotions he clearly wasn't equipped to process. Sarah Chun had tears visible on her face now, her professional composure cracking in the face of James's story and the stark contrast between his demonstrated valor and the treatment he'd received tonight. A 3rd vehicle pulled up to the scene, an unmarked sedan that disgorged a man in civilian clothes who moved with unmistakable authority. Sheriff Michael Rodriguez, responding to a notification from dispatch about a traffic stop involving a Medal of Honor recipient that had apparently generated some kind of incident requiring supervisory attention. "Someone want to tell me what the hell is happening here?" Rodriguez demanded, his eyes sweeping across the scene and immediately landing on James's uniform and the unmistakable ribbon at his neck. "Thompson, please tell me you didn't just conduct an aggressive traffic stop on a Medal of Honor recipient without having a damn good reason that you can articulate clearly and convincingly. When have you witnessed someone being judged unfairly and said nothing because it was easier to stay silent? Or maybe you found the courage to speak up when others wouldn't? Drop your story below. Sometimes sharing our regrets or our bravest moments helps someone else find their voice when it matters most." Sheriff Michael Rodriguez's arrival transformed the roadside scene from a tense confrontation between officers and a decorated veteran into something that resembled a crisis management situation where reputations and careers hung in the balance. Rodriguez was a 30-year law enforcement veteran who'd earned respect through competence rather than politics, and his expression as he absorbed the situation made clear that he understood immediately how badly this encounter could reflect on his department, if not handled with extreme care and genuine accountability. "Colonel Mitchell," Rodriguez said, approaching with his hand extended in greeting rather than challenge, his entire demeanor reflecting respect that should have characterized this encounter from the beginning. "Sheriff Michael Rodriguez, I apologize profoundly for whatever has transpired here tonight. Would you be willing to give me 5 minutes of your time to hear your account of what happened before I speak with my officers?" James shook the sheriff's hand firmly, evaluating him with the same careful assessment he'd applied to officers under his command throughout his military career, looking for signs of genuine integrity versus political maneuvering designed to minimize embarrassment. "Sheriff Rodriguez, I'll give you an honest account because that's what this situation deserves. But I want to be clear that this isn't an isolated incident unique to your department or Officer Thompson specifically. This is a pattern I've experienced dozens of times throughout my life despite my service record and accomplishments, and it's a pattern that affects countless other Black Americans with even less protection than military rank and decorations provide." He proceeded to describe the traffic stop in methodical detail. Thompson's aggressive commands from the beginning, the lack of explanation for why he'd been pulled over, the rough pat-down that went beyond reasonable safety precautions, the entire tenor of the encounter that communicated suspicion and threat rather than professional law enforcement procedure. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening progressively as James's account unfolded, and the implications became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "Officer Thompson," the sheriff said when James had finished, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that promised consequences beyond anything Thompson might have anticipated. "Tell me exactly what reasonable suspicion justified initiating this traffic stop. And I want specific details, not vague descriptions about matching suspect descriptions or general feelings that something seemed off. What specific observable behaviors or violations did you witness that provided legal justification for pulling over Colonel Mitchell's vehicle?" Thompson stammered through an explanation about a bolo. "Be on the lookout for an older model sedan involved in a convenience store robbery 3 counties away the previous week. A description so generic that it could have applied to tens of thousands of vehicles throughout Alabama on any given evening, and his inability to articulate anything more specific than I thought it warranted investigation. Told everyone present exactly what they already suspected about his actual motivations. So you conducted an aggressive traffic stop on a citizen who had committed no traffic violations and whose vehicle only matched a suspect description in the most general possible terms. Older sedan, black male driver. Is that an accurate summary of your decision-making here?" Rodriguez's voice had dropped to a quiet intensity that was somehow more frightening than if he'd been yelling. "And you did this without apparently noticing that said citizen was wearing a military dress uniform, which should have at minimum suggested that maybe an aggressive approach wasn't necessary. You didn't think that perhaps treating him with basic respect and courtesy might be more appropriate than immediately assuming he was a threat who needed to be removed from his vehicle and searched." Thompson had no good answer because there was no good answer. Nothing he could say that would make his actions appear reasonable or justified rather than revealing them as exactly what they were. Assumptions based on racial bias translated into aggressive policing that humiliated someone who deserved the exact opposite treatment. Sarah Chun stepped forward, her expression reflecting both professional duty and personal conviction. "Sheriff, I need to state for the record that when I arrived as backup, I immediately recognized that this situation had escalated beyond what the circumstances warranted. I attempted to alert Officer Thompson to Colonel Mitchell's uniform and decorations, but he was committed to his initial assessment and resisted adjusting his approach even when presented with clear evidence that his assumptions were incorrect. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to deflect responsibility for being present during this encounter, but I also want accurate documentation of who made what decisions and when." Her willingness to provide honest testimony, even when it might implicate a fellow officer, spoke to the kind of integrity that James had spent his career trying to instill in soldiers under his command, the understanding that loyalty to truth had to supersede loyalty to individuals when the two came into conflict. Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement to Chun before turning his attention back to James. "Colonel Mitchell, I need to ask you a difficult question. I hope you'll answer honestly, even though I have no right to ask for your grace or understanding. Do you want to file a formal complaint against Officer Thompson for his conduct during this stop?" You would be absolutely within your rights to do so. And I want you to know that such a complaint would be investigated thoroughly and that Officer Thompson would face appropriate disciplinary consequences based on what that investigation revealed. I'm not asking you to let this go or pretend it didn't happen. I'm simply ensuring you understand your options and your rights in this situation. The offer was genuine, not the performative gesture of someone trying to appear fair while secretly hoping the problem would go away quietly. And James appreciated the directness, even as he considered his response carefully. Sheriff Rodriguez, what I want is more complicated than a single complaint against one officer can address, James said slowly, thinking through his words with the same care he'd applied to mission planning during his military career. I want this to be the last time one of your officers makes assumptions about threat level based primarily on skin color rather than actual behavior. I want comprehensive training on implicit bias that goes beyond checking a box on professional development requirements and actually changes how your deputies think about the communities they police. I want accountability not just for this specific incident, but for the pattern of behavior that made this incident possible in the first place. And most importantly, I want every officer in your department to understand that the Medal of Honor I'm wearing tonight shouldn't be what finally makes them recognize my humanity and dignity. Those things should be assumed for every citizen they encounter regardless of their race, their vehicle, their neighborhood, or their appearance. If filing a formal complaint against Officer Thompson would contribute to achieving those broader goals, then I'm willing to do that. But if it would simply result in one officer being disciplined while the underlying culture and assumptions remain unchanged, then I'm not interested in symbolic gestures that make your department look responsive without actually addressing the systemic problems. The power and clarity of James's response left everyone on that roadside momentarily speechless. The weight of his experience and authority settling over them like a physical presence that demanded acknowledgement. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in low tones for several minutes before returning his attention to the group. Colonel Mitchell, I've just spoken with our county commissioner and our police review board chairman, both of whom I woke up to brief on this situation because they needed to know immediately what had occurred. With your permission, we'd like to invite you to serve as a consultant for our department's bias training program, working with our training officers to develop curriculum that addresses exactly the issues you've identified. We'd compensate you for your time at our standard expert consultant rate, and we'd give you significant input into how that training is designed and delivered. Additionally, I'm placing Officer Thompson on administrative leave pending a full investigation of this incident, and I'm recommending that he undergo extensive additional training on traffic stop procedures and implicit bias before being reinstated to patrol duties. That's not everything you've asked for, and it's certainly not adequate recompense for what you experienced tonight, but it's a start toward the kind of systemic change you've described. James considered the offer carefully, evaluating its sincerity and its potential to actually create meaningful change versus simply providing political cover for the department. Sheriff, I appreciate the offer, and I'm willing to consider it seriously, but I need to understand what kind of authority I would actually have in shaping that training program. I'm not interested in being window dressing or in providing superficial review of materials that have already been decided. If I'm going to invest my time and experience in this project, I need to know that I'll have genuine input into content, delivery methods, and assessment criteria for whether officers have actually internalized the lessons rather than just completing required hours. Can you guarantee that level of involvement and authority? Rodriguez nodded without hesitation. Colonel, you would have veto power over any materials or approaches that you felt were inadequate or counterproductive. This would be your program to design with our training staff supporting your vision, not the other way around. If that's not acceptable, if we can't give you that level of control and respect, then I completely understand your decision to decline the offer. Bradley Thompson, who had remained silent through this entire exchange, finally found his voice again, though it came out small and chastened in ways that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Colonel Mitchell, sir, I know my apology doesn't mean much at this point and doesn't undo what I put you through tonight, but I need you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for my conduct and my assumptions. You deserved better treatment from the moment I approached your vehicle, and the fact that I only recognize that after seeing your Medal of Honor means I have serious work to do on my own biases and assumptions. If there's anything I can do to make this right, any way I can demonstrate that I've learned from this mistake and become a better officer because of it, please tell me, and I'll do it. The apology was awkward and inadequate, but it seemed sincere, the words of someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and was struggling to process the revelation. James looked at Thompson for a long moment before responding, his expression unreadable as he evaluated whether the young officer's remorse was genuine or simply fear of professional consequences. Officer Thompson, what I want from you is very simple, but also very difficult. I want you to remember this feeling, the shame, the embarrassment, the horror of realizing you've treated someone with disrespect who deserve your honor. And I want you to carry that feeling with you every time you approach a vehicle or encounter a citizen in the course of your duties. Not because I want you to suffer or because I believe in punishment for its own sake, but because that discomfort might save someone's life someday. The next time you're tempted to make assumptions about threat level based on appearance rather than behavior, I want you to remember this moment and choose differently. That's the only restitution that actually matters. That my humiliation tonight prevents someone else's tragedy tomorrow. Can you do that, Officer Thompson? Can you transform your shame into better practice going forward? Thompson nodded, tears now visible on his face as the full weight of what he'd done and what it represented settled fully into his consciousness. Yes, sir, I can do that. I will do that. I promise you that I'll be a better officer because of this encounter, that I'll question my assumptions and treat every citizen with the respect they deserve regardless of how they look or what they're driving or what neighborhood they live in. That's the least I owe you after what I put you through tonight. Sarah Chun had been observing this entire exchange with an expression that mixed professional interest with obvious emotional response to James's wisdom and grace in this impossible situation. Colonel Mitchell, I want to add my own commitment to what Officer Thompson has promised. I've been an officer for 8 years, and I like to think I've been a good one. But watching how you've handled this situation with such dignity and such clear vision for what actually needs to change, that's shown me I have my own work to do on recognizing and addressing implicit bias, even when I think I'm already doing better than my colleagues. Thank you for that lesson, even though you never asked to provide it and shouldn't have been put in a position where it was necessary. The sound of another vehicle approaching made everyone turn to see a news van from a Montgomery television station pulling onto the shoulder, apparently alerted to the situation by someone monitoring police scanners who'd heard dispatch traffic about a Medal of Honor recipient and a traffic stop requiring supervisory response. A reporter and cameraman emerged from a van, and Sheriff Rodriguez's expression shifted from controlled crisis management to visible concern about media coverage that could make this situation significantly more complicated politically and professionally. James held up his hand in a gesture that stopped the news crew from approaching immediately. Sheriff Rodriguez, how would you like to handle media inquiries about this incident? I'm willing to speak with them if you believe it would help achieve the kind of systemic change we've been discussing, or I'm willing to decline comment and let your department handle communications through official channels. This is your jurisdiction and your department, so I'll follow your lead on how to manage the public relations aspects. Rodriguez looked genuinely surprised by the offer, clearly having expected James to be eager to publicize his mistreatment and embarrass the department as thoroughly as possible through media exposure. Colonel Mitchell, I appreciate that consideration more than you can possibly know, but I actually think it would be valuable for you to speak honestly with media about what happened tonight and what it represents. If we're serious about creating real change rather than just managing embarrassment, then transparency about our failures is necessary, even when it's uncomfortable. Tell your story truthfully. Share your perspective on what needs to change, and I'll back you up publicly with concrete commitments about training reforms and accountability measures. The only way we build trust with communities that have every reason to distrust law enforcement is by acknowledging our failures openly and demonstrating through actions that we're committed to improvement. The answer revealed a level of integrity and courage that James hadn't necessarily expected to find in a county sheriff. and it increased his willingness to believe that the offers of consultation and systemic reform might actually be genuine rather than merely performative. James approached the news crew, his military bearing evident in every step, the Medal of Honor visible around his neck, catching the lights from the cameras that were already rolling to capture footage of whatever statement he might provide. "My name is Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army retired. Tonight, I was subjected to an aggressive traffic stop by Officer Bradley Thompson of this county sheriff's department, pulled over without having committed any traffic violations, removed from my vehicle, and searched based on nothing more than driving while black in a vehicle that supposedly matched a vague suspect description from an unrelated crime. This is not a new experience for me. I've been pulled over dozens of times throughout my life for similar non-reasons, despite decades of military service and a record of accomplishment that should have earned me the benefit of the doubt that white citizens receive automatically in similar situations. The difference tonight is that I'm wearing the Medal of Honor, which finally made the officers recognize their error after subjecting me to humiliation that should never have occurred regardless of what decorations I wear or what rank I've achieved. What concerns me most is not what happened to me. I'm experienced enough and privileged enough in some ways to survive these encounters. What concerns me is all the other Black Americans who face similar situations without the protection of military service or distinguished careers, whose encounters with law enforcement based on implicit bias and racial assumptions escalate into violence and tragedy instead of uncomfortable conversations about systemic change. That's what needs to change, and that's what I'm committed to working toward in partnership with Sheriff Rodriguez if his department demonstrates genuine commitment to reform rather than just damage control. The reporter, clearly recognizing the significance of both the story and the subject, asked follow-up questions about James's military service, his perspective on race relations and policing, and his thoughts on what meaningful reform would actually look like in practice rather than just policy statements. James answered each question with the same measured clarity he demonstrated throughout this entire ordeal, neither inflammatory in his criticism nor willing to minimize the severity of what had occurred and what it represented. The interview would be broadcast on the evening news the following day and would be picked up by national media within hours after that, sparking conversations about policing, implicit bias, veteran treatment, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice that would reach far beyond this rural Alabama roadside and the specific individuals involved in this particular incident. The following morning, Sheriff Michael Rodriguez sat in his office watching the television coverage of James Mitchell's interview play across multiple news channels, each one leading with footage of the Medal of Honor recipient, describing his treatment at the hands of Thompson in the broader context of racial profiling that made such encounters commonplace rather than exceptional. The story had exploded overnight, trending on social media platforms under hashtags like hashtag Medal of Honor Profiled and hashtag Serving While Black, with thousands of veterans, Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, sharing their own stories of differential treatment based on race despite their military service. Rodriguez's phone had been ringing constantly since 6 that morning with calls from the county commission, the state attorney general's office, veterans organizations demanding accountability, civil rights groups offering support for reform efforts, and media outlets requesting interviews and additional information. The pressure was intense and growing, but Rodriguez had meant what he'd said about transparency and accountability, and he was determined to follow through even when it became politically uncomfortable. Officer Bradley Thompson sat in his apartment watching the same coverage, his stomach churning with a mixture of shame, fear, and belated understanding of exactly how badly he'd miscalculated the previous evening. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from family members, friends, and colleagues, along with hundreds of social media notifications that he was afraid to open because he knew they would contain exactly the kind of criticism and anger he deserved, but wasn't sure he could emotionally handle. His police academy instructors had taught him about proper traffic stop procedures, about treating all citizens with respect, about the importance of de-escalation, and recognizing when situations didn't actually warrant aggressive responses. But somewhere between academy training and street experience, he'd absorbed other lessons from older officers who talked about gut feelings and knowing trouble when you see it coded language for racial profiling that he'd accepted without sufficient critical examination because it came from people he'd been taught to respect and emulate. Now, watching Colonel Mitchell describe with painful clarity how it felt to be judged by skin color rather than character or accomplishments, Thompson was being forced to confront truths about himself and his profession that he'd successfully avoided thinking about for his entire 5-year law enforcement career. Sarah Chun had called a meeting with several other officers she trusted, younger deputies who'd expressed concerns privately about some of the department's practices, but hadn't known how to address them through official channels without being labeled as troublemakers or disloyal to their colleagues. What happened last night can't be an isolated learning moment for Thompson alone, she told the group gathered in a conference room before their shifts began. We all need to examine our own assumptions and practices, our own moments when we've let implicit bias influence our decisions, even if we never consciously articulate racist beliefs. I've been thinking about traffic stops I've conducted, people I've approached with more suspicion than the situation warranted, and I'm not comfortable with everything I'm remembering. If we're serious about being good officers who serve all members of our community equitably, then we need to be honest about where we've fallen short and committed to doing better going forward. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable but necessary, with officers sharing their own experiences with racial profiling, both as perpetrators and sometimes as victims, and beginning to articulate what meaningful change would actually require beyond policy statements and mandatory training sessions. James Mitchell spent that morning fielding calls from veterans organizations, civil rights groups, media outlets, and even several members of Congress who wanted to express their support and offer assistance in whatever form he might find useful. The Medal of Honor Society, the exclusive organization of living recipients, had issued a statement condemning his treatment and calling for comprehensive law enforcement reform to address racial bias in policing. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs had called personally to apologize on behalf of the administration for what James had experienced and to offer full support for whatever actions he wanted to pursue. But the call that meant most to James came from Marcus Thompson, a young black veteran he'd been mentoring through PTSD recovery at the VA office, who'd seen the news coverage and wanted James to know how much his public response had meant. Colonel Mitchell, sir, watching you handle that situation with such dignity, watching you refuse to let them reduce you to just another victim, watching you demand systemic change instead of just personal apology, that showed me something I needed to see about how to carry myself when facing prejudice and discrimination. Thank you for that example, even though you never asked to provide it. By noon, Sheriff Rodriguez had scheduled a press conference to address the incident formally and announce concrete steps the department would be taking in response. James had agreed to attend and speak, seeing it as an opportunity to hold the department accountable publicly while also recognizing genuine efforts at reform that deserve support rather than just criticism. The courthouse steps were crowded with media representatives, community members, veterans in uniform who'd come to show solidarity, and civil rights activists who'd organized quickly to ensure this moment didn't pass without demanding substantial change. Rodriguez approached the microphone bank with visible tension in his shoulders, but determination in his expression. Yesterday evening, one of my officers conducted a traffic stop that violated the dignity and rights of Colonel James Mitchell, a decorated war hero who has served this nation with extraordinary valor and distinction. After reviewing the incident thoroughly, I can state unequivocally that the stop was conducted based on insufficient justification, that it reflected racial bias in the decision to initiate the stop and in the aggressive manner in which it was conducted, and that it represents exactly the kind of policing that erodes community trust and undermines public safety rather than enhancing it. The sheriff's direct acknowledgement of racial bias drew murmurs from the crowd, some appreciative of the honesty and others skeptical that words would translate into meaningful action. Rodriguez continued without pausing. Officer Bradley Thompson has been placed on administrative leave pending completion of a full internal investigation and external review by our Civilian Oversight Board. Regardless of that investigation's outcome, Officer Thompson will be required to complete extensive additional training on implicit bias, appropriate use of force, and community-oriented policing before any consideration of reinstatement to active duty. Additionally, I am immediately implementing several department-wide reforms. First, all officers will undergo mandatory implicit bias training developed in consultation with Colonel Mitchell and other community stakeholders, with annual recertification required. Second, we are implementing a body camera policy that requires activation for all traffic stops and citizen encounters, with severe disciplinary consequences for officers who fail to record interactions without legitimate justification. Third, we are establishing a community advisory board with real authority to review complaints, access records, and make binding recommendations about policy and practice. And fourth, we are partnering with local veterans organizations to ensure our officers receive specific training on veteran recognition and appropriate protocols for interactions with service members and veterans. James stepped to the microphone after Rodriguez finished, the Medal of Honor prominent against his civilian clothes, his bearings still unmistakably military despite the absence of uniform. Sheriff Rodriguez has made commitments today that I intend to hold him and this department accountable for keeping. But I want to be clear about something. This is not just about one department in one Alabama county. What happened to me happens to Black Americans every single day across this country, in rural counties and major cities, in wealthy neighborhoods and poor ones, to people with distinguished careers and people just starting their lives. We've spent decades having conversations about racial bias in policing, issuing reports, conducting studies, implementing training programs that check boxes without changing cultures. What I'm demanding now, what communities across this country have been demanding for generations, is transformation rather than tinkering, accountability rather than excuses, and recognition that Black lives and Black dignity matter just as much as any others regardless of what medals we wear or what ranks we've achieved. The Medal of Honor I'm wearing bought me protection last night that every American should receive automatically. That's the standard we need to demand and the reality we need to build. The press conference lasted another 45 minutes with questions from reporters about specific reforms, timelines for implementation, oversight mechanisms, and broader implications for law enforcement practices nationwide. Several veterans in the crowd spoke about their own experiences with racial profiling despite military service, adding their voices to James's call for comprehensive change. A young Black woman who identified herself as a law student shared her family's experiences with aggressive policing and thanked James for using his platform to advocate for people without his level of protection and recognition. An older white veteran apologized publicly for times he'd remained silent when witnessing racial profiling, acknowledging his own complicity in systems that harmed his fellow veterans and fellow citizens. The event became something larger than a response to a single traffic stop, transforming into a community conversation about race, justice, service, and the ongoing work required to build a society that lived up to its stated ideals rather than just performing them rhetorically. Officer Bradley Thompson watched the press conference from his apartment, tears streaming down his face as he confronted the full impact of his actions and the broader context he'd failed to recognize or acknowledge throughout his law enforcement career. He'd grown up in a predominantly white community where discussions of race were uncomfortable and usually avoided, where not being racist was considered sufficient without examining how systems and assumptions perpetuated inequality even in the absence of explicit bigotry. His police training had touched on implicit bias in a perfunctory way, one session among dozens covering various topics, easily forgotten under the pressure of street experience and the informal education provided by veteran officers whose attitudes reflected generations of problematic policing practices. Now, watching Colonel Mitchell speak with such clarity about dignity and justice and the difference between symbolic gestures and substantive change, Thompson was being forced to choose between defensiveness and growth, between protecting his ego and acknowledging painful truths that required him to fundamentally reconsider his approach to his profession and his responsibilities. Sarah Chun had organized a meeting at her church that evening, inviting community members to share their experiences with law enforcement and to participate in developing the civilian oversight board that Sheriff Rodriguez had committed to establishing. The turnout exceeded expectations, with the fellowship hall packed beyond capacity and people standing along the walls or sitting on the floor to participate. Stories emerged that painted a picture of consistent patterns rather than isolated incidents. Black residents pulled over for minor or fabricated violations. Latino families questioned about immigration status during routine traffic stops. Young people treated with suspicion simply for existing in public spaces, complaints dismissed or investigated inadequately. Officers facing minimal consequences even when violations were documented clearly. But alongside the stories of frustration and mistreatment came expressions of hope that maybe this time would be different. That Colonel Mitchell's experience and his refusal to accept hollow apologies might actually catalyze the kind of change that previous incidents had failed to generate. James attended the community meeting at Chen's invitation, listening more than speaking as people shared experiences that resonated painfully with his own despite the specifics varying. An elderly black man described being thrown against a police car during a traffic stop in the 1960s, beaten with nightsticks for questioning why he'd been pulled over, and told that boys like you needed to learn their place. A young black mother shared her terror every time her teenage son left the house, knowing that his hoodie and his skin color made him a target for suspicion regardless of his character or his straight-A academic record. A black business owner discussed being stopped repeatedly near his own establishment because officers assumed someone who looked like him couldn't possibly own property in that neighborhood. The stories accumulated weight, painting a comprehensive picture of how racial bias in policing affected entire communities across generations. Trauma and mistrust passed down from parents to children who learned early that police might be threats rather than protectors, depending on the color of your skin. I need to say something that might be uncomfortable, James said when invited to speak toward the end of the meeting. What happened to me was wrong, and I'm grateful for Sheriff Rodriguez's apparent commitment to reform and for Officer Chen's integrity in acknowledging problems within her profession. But we need to be realistic about what one incident and one department's reforms can actually accomplish. Implicit bias training helps, but it's not sufficient by itself. Body cameras provide accountability, but only if policies require their use and if violations lead to real consequences. Civilian oversight matters, but only if the boards have genuine authority and adequate resources to conduct thorough investigations. What transforms policing is sustained pressure, consistent accountability, community engagement that goes beyond symbolic gestures, and most importantly, cultural change within law enforcement that values de-escalation and human dignity over demonstrating dominance and maintaining hierarchies based on race and class. That's generational work, not a problem that gets solved with a few policy changes and some training sessions. Are we prepared for that long-term commitment? Or will we allow this moment of attention to fade as soon as the media moves on to the next story? The question challenged everyone in that fellowship hall. Community members, officers who'd attended to listen, activists who'd been working on these issues for years, and casual observers who'd been drawn by the dramatic story but might not sustain engagement when the cameras left. Martha Williams, a retired teacher who'd been organizing for civil rights since the 1960s, stood to respond. Colonel Mitchell, some of us have been doing this work our entire lives, long before it was trending on social media and long before we had smartphones to record every interaction. We'll still be doing it when the cameras leave and the national media loses interest, because this isn't optional for us. It's survival. It's protecting our children and grandchildren. It's building the community we want to live in rather than just accepting the one we inherited. What you've given us with your public stand is momentum and attention we can use to advance work that was already happening but needed a catalyst. So yes, we're prepared for long-term commitment because we've already been committed for decades. The question is whether people who've had the privilege of not thinking about these issues until they became unavoidable will stay engaged when it's no longer convenient or dramatic. Her response drew sustained applause and knowing nods from community members who'd been advocating for police reform long before James's traffic stop made headlines. James nodded acknowledgement of her point, recognizing that his experience, while significant, was one moment in a much longer struggle that predated him and would continue long after media attention faded. The meeting concluded with concrete action steps. formation of the Civilian Oversight Board with specific timelines and selection processes, creation of community policing working groups that would meet monthly, establishment of a formal complaint tracking system with public reporting of outcomes, and commitment to regular forums where community members could interact with officers in non-enforcement contexts to build relationships based on something other than suspicion and power dynamics. The work ahead was extensive and difficult, but the energy in that fellowship hall suggested that maybe, finally, there was sufficient will to pursue transformation rather than just temporary reforms that would be abandoned as soon as pressure lessened. Block 5, 3 months after that roadside encounter that had seemed designed to humiliate, but had instead catalyzed broader change. Colonel James Mitchell stood before a class of 47 law enforcement officers from 6 different Alabama counties, leading a training session on implicit bias that bore little resemblance to the perfunctory checkbox exercises that typically pass for diversity education in police departments. The curriculum he developed in partnership with Sheriff Rodriguez, Officer Chun, and a team of psychologists, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates was comprehensive and challenging, requiring officers to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their profession, and the systems they operated within. I'm not here to tell you that you're all bad people or that law enforcement is irredeemably racist, James told the assembled officers, his command presence filling the training room even in civilian clothes. I'm here to help you understand how good people can perpetuate harmful systems when they don't examine their assumptions, how fear and bias can masquerade as officer safety concerns, and how the communities you're supposed to serve experience policing very differently depending on their race, their economic status, their neighborhood, and countless other factors that should be irrelevant to whether they receive respectful treatment and equal protection under the law. The training wasn't comfortable or easy, deliberately designed to challenge rather than reassure, to provoke genuine reflection rather than simply provide information that officers could passively receive without examining their own practices and assumptions. James showed video footage of dozens of traffic stops, some handled professionally and some demonstrating clear bias in how quickly they escalated based primarily on the driver's race rather than their behavior. He shared data on disproportionate stop rates, search patterns, use of force incidents, and arrest disparities that revealed systemic patterns even when individual officers believed they were treating everyone fairly. He brought in community members to share their experiences with policing, including veterans who'd been profiled despite their service and professionals who'd been treated as suspects despite their accomplished careers and unblemished records. And most powerfully, he required officers to complete exercises where they experienced simulated traffic stops from the citizen's perspective, feeling the vulnerability and fear that comes from being pulled over without clear cause and subjected to aggressive questioning by someone with legal authority to use force against you if they decide your reaction suggests danger. Officer Bradley Thompson was among the trainees in that room, having petitioned Sheriff Rodriguez for the opportunity to participate even though his administrative leave hadn't yet been lifted and his employment status remained uncertain pending completion of internal investigations and oversight board review. His presence created initial tension among some of the other officers who knew his history and worried that his participation would make the training feel more like punishment than professional development. But James had advocated for including Thompson specifically because genuine transformation required engaging people who'd made mistakes rather than just casting them out and assuming the problem was solved. Officer Thompson made assumptions about me based on racial bias, and he subjected me to treatment that was humiliating and wrong. James told the class during the first session when Thompson's presence was addressed directly. But he also acknowledged his error, expressed genuine remorse, and has demonstrated commitment to learning and growing from the experience. If we believe people are capable of change, then we have to create space for that change to occur rather than simply punishing mistakes and assuming the work is done. Officer Thompson's journey from the assumptions that led to my traffic stop to the understanding he's developing now is exactly the transformation we need to encourage throughout law enforcement. The training program attracted significant attention beyond the initial participant counties, with law enforcement agencies from across the country reaching out to inquire about curriculum materials, implementation strategies, and assessment methods for evaluating whether officers had actually internalized lessons rather than just completing required hours. James found himself traveling regularly to speak at police academies, presenting at law enforcement conferences, and consulting with departments that were finally beginning to recognize that addressing implicit bias required sustained effort rather than one-time interventions. The Medal of Honor Society had formally endorsed his work, with several other recipients joining him in advocating for police reform and veteran-sensitive training that recognized service members' contributions while also acknowledging that military service didn't protect against racial profiling. The work was exhausting and often frustrating when resistance emerged from officers or departments that resented being told they needed a change. But James approached it with the same persistence and commitment he'd brought to every mission throughout his military career. Marcus Thompson, the young veteran James had been mentoring, had become an assistant in the training program, sharing his own experiences with PTSD, his struggles with civilian reintegration, and his encounters with law enforcement that had ranged from supportive to actively harmful, depending largely on the individual officer's understanding of veteran issues and their assumptions based on his race. Colonel Mitchell saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with his work on police reform. Marcus told trainees during one session, "When I came home from Afghanistan, I was dealing with trauma that I didn't understand and didn't know how to talk about. I had panic attacks in crowded spaces. I struggled with anger management. I isolated myself from family and friends because I felt like nobody could possibly understand what I'd experienced or who I'd become. During one particularly bad episode, I was pulled over for erratic driving, and I know my behavior seemed suspicious because I was dissociated and not responding clearly to the officer's questions. That officer recognized signs of PTSD, called for backup that included someone trained in crisis intervention, and they got me connected with the VA and with Colonel Mitchell's mentoring program instead of arresting me or escalating into a use of force situation that could have ended very differently. That's what good policing looks like. Recognizing that sometimes people need help rather than handcuffs, that de-escalation and compassion can be more effective than aggression and control. Sarah Chun had been promoted to training coordinator for the department, putting her in charge of implementing and sustaining the reforms that had emerged from James's traffic stop and the community conversations that followed. She developed close working relationships with the Civilian Oversight Board, creating accountability mechanisms that went beyond policy statements to include regular audits of traffic stop data, use of force reports, complaint investigation outcomes, and officer discipline records. The transparency was uncomfortable initially, revealing patterns that some within the department would have preferred to keep hidden, but it was also beginning to rebuild trust with community members who'd spent generations learning that official promises of reform rarely translated into changed practices. The hardest part isn't implementing new policies, Chun told a gathering of community activists and law enforcement officials at a regional conference on police reform. The hardest part is changing the culture that makes officers feel like acknowledging bias or admitting mistakes makes them weak or disloyal. We've created a profession where being honest about fear or uncertainty is seen as liability rather than humanity, where officers are supposed to project absolute confidence and control even in ambiguous situations, where admitting you handled something poorly feels like betraying your fellow officers. Until we change that culture, until we create space for officers to be reflective and self-critical without fearing professional consequences, we're not going to achieve the kind of transformation that communities deserve and that honestly most officers want but don't know how to pursue within current departmental cultures. The Civilian Oversight Board that had been established in response to James's traffic stop had evolved into a model that other jurisdictions were studying and attempting to replicate. Unlike many oversight boards that existed primarily on paper with limited actual authority, this board had teeth, subpoena power to access records, and compel testimony, independent investigators who reported to the board rather than to the sheriff's department, authority to impose discipline up to and including termination in cases where internal investigations were inadequate, and most importantly, community credibility because its members were genuinely representative and weren't seen as captured by law enforcement interests. Martha Williams, the retired teacher who challenged James about sustained commitment, served as board chair and brought decades of civil rights organizing experience to the role. "We've reviewed 37 complaints in the past 3 months," she reported at a public meeting. "Of those, we found 13 involved clear policy violations. 6 involved implicit bias that influenced officer decisions, even if they didn't violate specific policies, and 18 were determined to be within policy bounds but raised questions about whether the policies themselves need revision. We've recommended discipline for 9 officers ranging from additional training to suspension. We've proposed 6 policy changes that Sheriff Rodriguez has committed to implementing, and we've identified 3 officers who demonstrate exemplary community policing practices that we believe should be recognized and held up as models for the department." Officer Bradley Thompson eventually completed his administrative leave and additional training, returning to active duty under probationary status that required regular supervision and review by both his chain of command and the Civilian Oversight Board. His first patrol shift back was supervised by Sarah Chun, who'd volunteered to partner with him during his reintegration period to ensure he had support while also maintaining accountability for how he conducted himself. Their first traffic stop together was a tense moment for Thompson, his hands visibly shaking as he approached a vehicle that had been weaving slightly across lane lines. But he followed his training meticulously, approaching with respect rather than aggression, explaining clearly why he'd initiated the stop, giving the driver, an elderly white woman who turned out to be struggling with a medical issue rather than impairment, the benefit of the doubt and calling for medical assistance rather than assuming the worst. "You did well," Chin told him afterward as they watched the ambulance transport the woman to the hospital for evaluation. "You recognized someone who needed help rather than seeing a potential threat. You de-escalated appropriately, and you likely saved her from a serious medical crisis by getting her treatment quickly. That's the kind of policing that builds trust and actually serves community safety rather than just generating arrests." James Mitchell's phone call with Bradley Thompson 2 months after his return to active duty was emotionally charged for both men, neither quite sure how to navigate the conversation between someone who'd been wronged and someone who'd caused that wrong, but was genuinely trying to make amends. "Colonel Mitchell, I wanted to update you on how things have been going and to thank you for advocating for my inclusion in your training program," Thompson said, his voice carrying nervousness but also determination. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, because what I did was inexcusable. But I want you to know that every single shift, I remember that night, and I use it to check myself when I feel assumptions creeping into my thinking. Last week I pulled over a young black man for a broken taillight, and I felt all my old instincts telling me to be more cautious, more aggressive, to assume potential threat. But instead I remembered your face when I realized who you were and what I'd done, and I forced myself to approach that interaction with the same respect I would automatically extend to someone who looked like me. The driver was polite. I was professional. I gave him a warning instead of a ticket and offered information about free taillight replacement programs through local churches. And as I walked back to my patrol car, I realized that this was the first time I'd conducted a traffic stop where I felt like I was actually serving rather than just enforcing. That's what your training and your example have given me, a different way of understanding my role and my responsibilities. Thank you for that gift, even though I did nothing to earn it." James listened to Thompson's account with the same careful attention he'd given to after-action reports from soldiers under his command, evaluating sincerity and commitment to change behavior. "Officer Thompson, I appreciate you sharing that with me, and I'm genuinely glad to hear you're putting the training into practice in ways that make a real difference in how you interact with citizens. But I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Your growth and your journey toward becoming a better officer. Those are good things, and I support them fully. But they don't undo what you did to me or to countless other Black Americans who've faced similar treatment. The work you're doing now should have been unnecessary because you should have treated me and everyone else with basic respect from the beginning, regardless of training or personal growth journeys. I'm glad you're changing, But the burden of that change shouldn't have been placed on me or my community through experiences of humiliation and degradation that forced you to finally see our humanity. Do you understand the difference? Thompson was silent for a long moment before responding, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, sir, I understand. The fact that it took my failure and your suffering to teach me lessons I should have already known from basic human decency and proper training. That's on me and on a system that allowed me to operate for years without adequately examining my biases. You're right that you shouldn't have had to experience what I put you through in order for me to learn what should have been obvious from the start. All I can do now is commit to being better going forward and to using whatever influence I have as an officer to push for changes that prevent other officers from making the same mistakes I made. I know that's inadequate recompense, but it's the only thing I can actually offer beyond continued apologies that don't change what happened. James accepted the response, recognizing in it the same kind of honest self-assessment he'd tried to instill in officers through his training program. Thompson wasn't minimizing his actions or asking to be praised for doing what should have been expected all along. And that humility suggested genuine growth rather than performative remorse designed to rehabilitate his image. 6 months after the roadside encounter that had sparked this journey, Sheriff Michael Rodriguez stood before the county commission presenting comprehensive data on the impact of the reforms they'd implemented. Traffic stop disparities had decreased by 42%, with Black and Latino drivers no longer being pulled over at rates dramatically disproportionate to their representation in the county population. Use of force incidents had dropped by 38% overall, with a reduction especially pronounced in encounters with people of color, where previous patterns had shown excessive force being applied more readily than in comparable situations involving white citizens. Community survey data showed increasing trust in law enforcement among previously skeptical populations, with residents reporting greater willingness to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, and view police as partners in public safety rather than as threats to be avoided. Officer satisfaction had actually increased rather than decreased despite initial resistance to reforms, with many reporting that they felt better about their work when they could engage communities positively rather than primarily through enforcement and control. And critically, actual crime rates had continued their existing downward trend, disproving the common argument that respectful policing and community accountability somehow undermine public safety. What Colonel Mitchell's traffic stop revealed to us wasn't just one officer's bias or one department's problems, Rodriguez told the commission. It revealed systemic issues that required systemic responses, cultural transformation rather than just policy adjustments, and sustained commitment to change rather than temporary reforms that would be abandoned when scrutiny decreased. The work we've done over these past months has been difficult, uncomfortable, and sometimes contentious, but it has also been absolutely necessary if we're serious about providing equal protection and equal dignity to all residents of this county regardless of their race, their economic status, or any other factor that should be irrelevant to how they're treated by law enforcement. I'm proud of the progress we've made. I'm grateful to Colonel Mitchell and the Civilian Oversight Board for holding us accountable, and I'm committed to sustaining these efforts for however long I remain in this position. This isn't finished work. It's generational transformation that requires constant attention and consistent accountability. But we've proven that change is possible when there's genuine will to pursue it. James Mitchell sat in that county commission meeting watching Rodriguez present the data, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction, exhaustion, and ongoing concern about whether the changes would be sustained once attention shifted to other priorities. He'd been invited to the front of the room multiple times throughout the presentation to provide commentary and answer questions, treated with the respect and recognition he'd earned, but had been denied on that roadside 6 months earlier. After the meeting concluded, several commissioners approached to thank him personally for his service, both military and civil, for his willingness to transform his humiliation into a catalyst for change rather than simply pursuing punitive responses, and for his ongoing commitment to training officers and working with communities even though he owed nothing to people who treated him so poorly. Colonel Mitchell, one commissioner said, "You could have sued us, could have demanded financial settlements, could have used your platform to destroy our department's reputation and our careers. Instead, you've invested hundreds of hours in trying to make us better, in building systems that will serve people you'll never meet long after today's headlines are forgotten. That's a level of grace and public service that goes beyond anything any of us had a right to expect. James accepted the gratitude, but redirected the focus where he believed it belonged. Commissioner, I didn't do this alone, and I wouldn't have been able to achieve anything without Sheriff Rodriguez's willingness to acknowledge problems honestly. Officer Chin's integrity in supporting reform despite it sometimes putting her at odds with colleagues. The Civilian Oversight Board determination to maintain high standards and real accountability, and most importantly, the community members who've been organizing for police reform for decades without the benefit of medals or national media attention to amplify their voices. What I brought was credentials and attention that made it harder to ignore demands that had been articulated long before my traffic stop occurred. The real heroes in this story are the people who kept fighting for justice when nobody was listening, who maintained hope that change was possible even after countless disappointments, and who are still doing this work today in communities where Medal of Honor recipients haven't been profiled on camera to create catalyzing moments. Those are the people we should be recognizing and supporting, not just the ones whose stories happen to go viral. As James drove home that evening, passing through the same area where he'd been pulled over 6 months earlier, he reflected on everything that had changed and everything that still needed to change before communities of color could experience policing as genuine protection rather than potential threat. The work had expanded far beyond this one Alabama county, with his training program now being implemented in 19 states and requests coming in from dozens more jurisdictions. The Medal of Honor Society had established a formal initiative on police reform with James as its chair, lending the organization's credibility to push for changes that other advocacy groups had been demanding without sufficient power to force implementation. And his story had become part of a larger national conversation about race, justice, service, and what it actually meant to build a country worthy of the sacrifices made by veterans who'd served believing they were defending ideals of equality and dignity for all citizens. His grandson, Deshaun, now preparing to start his freshman year at a historically black college on an ROTC scholarship, called that evening to talk about his plans and his gratitude for everything James had taught him about service and dignity and refusing to let others define your worth. Grandpa, I've been thinking about why you didn't just sue them or go on all the media shows to maximize your attention and compensation, Deshaun said. I think I understand now that you saw an opportunity to create change that mattered more than personal vindication, to use your platform for something larger than yourself, to demonstrate the same kind of service in retirement that you showed throughout your military career. That's the example I want to follow, using whatever opportunities and influence I have to lift others up rather than just advancing myself. Thank you for showing me what that looks like in practice, not just in theory. James felt tears forming as he listened to his grandson articulate values that he'd tried to live throughout his life, but had never been quite sure were being absorbed and internalized by younger generations facing very different challenges than he'd navigated. Deshaun, you're going to face situations where people judge you unfairly, where they assume things about your abilities or your character based on your skin color rather than your actual conduct. When those moments come, and they will come despite all the progress we've made, I want you to remember that their assumptions reveal their limitations, not yours. Hold on to your dignity. Demand the respect you deserve. Do excellent work that speaks for itself, and use whatever platform you earn to create change that benefits people who will never know your name. That's how we honor the sacrifices of everyone who came before us and everyone who'll come after. That's how we build the country we want to live in rather than just accepting the one we inherited. And that's how we transform pain into purpose, humiliation into momentum for justice, and individual suffering into collective progress toward a future where no one has to earn basic human dignity through medals or accomplishments because it's recognized as the birthright of everyone regardless of who they are or where they come from. Colonel Mitchell's story challenges us to think about how we respond when we witness injustice. Do we stay silent because it's easier, or do we speak up even when it costs us something. And if you've ever been misjudged because of how you look rather than who you are, how did you find the strength to maintain your dignity in that moment? Share your reflections below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this moved you, please subscribe and help us build a community that believes character matters more than appearances, that dignity can't be earned because it's inherent to being human, and that real change requires sustained commitment rather than just temporary outrage. What story should we explore next? What conversations do we need to have? Thank you for being here and for believing that we can build something better together.